So it looked like all the data ended up in a staging database. What does that mean?
Yeah, so in our last example, we loaded the data using input flows. And that took the raw data from those source systems and it loaded it into the MarkLogic Data Hub as is. Now that's valuable, it's indexed, it's discoverable, but it most likely doesn't look like we would want it to in order to effectively meet those business requirements that we have. And that's where curation comes into play. We will curate the data to make it more valuable, to make it easier and faster to meet those business requirements. And when we curate the data, it will get moved from staging into the final database.
Okay, so can we curate the data now?
Yeah, how would you go about doing that?
Well, our customer wants to do analytics on profit margins across all the company data that we have, and we brought the company data in from two different sources that weren't modeled the same way. So I think in our first curated version, we mapped just the data that we need into a consistent representation.
That's right, I would agree.
Now, what about profit margin?
I didn't see that in the data, and it doesn't make much sense to calculate profit margin at runtime since performing analytics on that is part of the business requirement. I think we should store profit margin with the company data.
Yes, I would agree with that as well. So follow along with me and I'll show you how we can achieve those goals in the data model by implementing a harmonization flow. So in our last hands-on exercise, we loaded both sources of our company data via input flows. And that data is now in the staging database, and now we're going to curate it. And so let's start by revisiting our data services first approach to data integration. Here are those business requirements again that we're developing data services in order to meet. And if we look at those requirements, and then we look at what our source data looks like inside of our staging database, this will drive what it is we want our curated data model to look like in order to have some consistency to develop those data services against. So in our situation, that means we're going to have to do some mapping to come up with canonical representations of what we want certain data properties to be modeled as inside of the final version of our hub. And it also means that in our Fortune 500 data, where we do not have the profit margin data, we will need to calculate that and include that in our curated data model. So to do that, we're going to leverage the mappings feature and harmonization flows of the MarkLogic Data Hub. So the first thing that we're going to do is go back into the quick start and we're going to modify our entity type definition. So let's go ahead and click on entities. And if you've been idle for a while, you're going to have to authenticate again. So just go ahead and do that. And no matter how you get there, let's get back to this entity page where we can go ahead and then edit our company entity. So let's click the pencil icon to edit our company entity. And what we're going to do is add properties to represent the canonical representation of that data that we want to drive our data services. So let's click the plus button here. And for our first property, let's call this company name. And you'll notice that I'm using camel case here, and that's because we're working in a JavaScript and JSON world for this example. So we'll adhere to that commonly adopted standard. Now let's set the data type. For company name, that's going to be a data type of string. So we'll call that a string. And then optionally, we could give this data a description. Because we're taking advantage of self-describing property names, I'm going to leave that blank in this example. And then we repeat. So let's add another property. And this one we're going to call total revenue. And total revenue is going to be a decimal if you looked at our sample data. Let's add another property. This one's going to be total profit. Also a decimal. We'll add another property here, and this is going to be for profit margin. Also a decimal. And because profit margin is actually a calculated value, maybe we want to actually describe this in our model with the formula of how that value is derived. So we could add the description, and for profit margin, that is total profit divided by total revenue multiplied by 100 to reflect that as a percentage. And then let's add our latitude. This is also a decimal, which can be positive or negative, representing distance above or below the equator. And then let's add one for longitude. Same thing with longitude, also a decimal, representing distance east or west of the prime meridian. Go ahead and pause your video. Make sure you've got that configured as you see here. Now, remember, what we're trying to deliver for our customer are services that will let them do analytics on some of this company information. So it's reasonable to assume that they're going to want to be querying this data and slicing and dicing it in different ways. So let's enable them to be able to do range type of queries based on things like revenue, profit, or profit margin. And to power range queries, we can provide a range index, and we can configure that range index directly through this interface. You'll notice that up here we see some various icons that represent different types of indexes. And one of those is the lightning icon, which is an element range index. Let's add a lightning bolt range index, really an element range index, for total revenue, total profit, and profit margin. And once you've got that configured as you see here, let's go ahead and click Save. And because we have activated some indexes, let's go ahead and click Yes so that those indexes will get deployed automatically. The next step in curating our data is to create our mappings. So let's go over here to the Quick Start and click on Mappings. And let's create our first mapping for the company entity. So let's click the plus icon and let's give this mapping a name. And let's call this Other Company Mapping, because this is going to be used for those companies that were outside of the Fortune 500. And we can describe that here. And once you're satisfied with that, let's go ahead and click Create. And now what we can see is that we have this interface which allows us to look at a sample document and map that to the canonical representation of those properties that we defined in our entity. And so the sample document is selected from our staging database, and if you don't like the sample document that was selected, you can edit that and insert a different URI in order to look at a different sample. For our purposes, the document that was selected here does represent one of those companies that are outside of the Fortune 500, so that's perfect for defining this mapping. And now what we need to do is over on the left, simply select the properties from this sample document to map them to the defined property name in our entity. So I'm going to select company name, I'm going to select total underscore revenue, and on down the line. And remember, for these companies, profit margin was expressed in the data, so we can go ahead and map that here. For our Fortune 500 companies, that profit margin is not in the data, so we won't be able to map it, but we will be able to calculate it through our harmonization flow. So let's go ahead and complete this mapping. And when we're satisfied with that, double check your work, and then go ahead and click Save Mapping. There we go. We have now created our first mapping. Next, we need to create a second mapping, and that is for the Fortune 500 company data. So let's go back over here under Company and create a new mapping. And let's call this one Fortune 500 Mapping. And we can describe it. And then click Create. Now you'll see that by default it again selected that same document that we used for the last mapping. But that's not what we want, because that sample document does not represent our Fortune 500 data. So we will need to change that. And in order to change it, we need to know the URI of a document we would like to use as our sample. So what I like to do here is just use Browse Data to help me figure out a good sample to use. But I don't want to click on this because I would prefer not to lose what I'm looking at on this window. So instead, I'm going to right-click on Browse Data and open that in a new tab. I find it's often helpful to have that Browse Data interface open in its own tab so you can switch back and forth from looking at your data to working in your Quick Start configurations. So let's find one of those Fortune 500 documents. Maybe we'll use our collection constraint there and then select one of these examples. Now all we really need is the URI. So I'm going to copy that whole thing, that entire string, starting with the leading slash all the way through .json. And I'm just going to copy that. And then I'm going to go back over to my mapping here, and I'm going to click the little pencil to edit the URI of my sample. And I'm going to get rid of the default and put in my new URI. We'll click the green check mark, and that will update our mapping, and we will now be able to select from properties that are represented in this sample. And then just like before, we're going to go through that process of mapping the data. So we'll find the name property, which represents company name. We'll find the revenues property, and on down the line. And again, we do not have profit margin in this data source, so we're just going to leave that blank here in our mapping. But we will go ahead and map the latitude and the longitude. Double check your work, and when you're satisfied, go ahead and click Save Mapping. Great, we've now created our two mappings. The next step is to create harmonization flows. So let's click on Flows in the Quick Start interface, and then let's look under our company entity and we'll see Harmonize Flows. Let's click the plus button next to Harmonize Flows to create our first flow. And for this first one, let's focus on curating and harmonizing that other company data, so those companies that are outside of the Fortune 500. And so let's give our flow a name, and I'm going to call this Harmonize Other Companies, for lack of a creative name. Now let's look at some of these configuration settings here. The first one we see is code generation, and the default is create structure from entity definition. Let's leave that checked. What that does is it impacts the plugins that get created for us, and it gives us some boilerplate code that aligns with the entity properties that we defined. So we'll go ahead and leave that. Next, let's look at this mapping generation. This is how we can apply our mapping. What we want to do is apply the other company mapping to this flow. So let's select that. And then for the last two configurations, plugin type and data format, let's leave those as their defaults of JavaScript and JSON. When you're ready, go ahead and click Create, and now we'll see our new flow. Now, harmonized flows have a lot less configuration. Harmonized flows are ran by Java, and so you can configure the batch size, how many documents you're processing in a batch, how many threads will be dedicated to this. But really, it's just an orchestration of the plugins in a sequence, and then finally writing that new harmonized data into the final database. So we will need to think a little bit about those plugins. And for this first example, let's take a look at one of those plugins, specifically the collector plugin. So let's click on collector here. Now, the collector plugin defines which documents will be processed by a flow. And you can see here, if we look at the code in the collector plugin, that the default is a very simple query that will return the document IDs or URIs for a certain set of documents. And this query is using a collection query based on the name of our entity, which in our case is company. And so by default, this will return all of the document URIs that are in the company collection. And if you think about how our data is organized in the staging database after we ran our input flows, remember that every single document that we loaded through our input flows are in the company collection. So that means all the Fortune 500 documents and all of the company documents of those outside of the Fortune 500. Well, what we really want to do here is process just those other companies. So we want to be a little more restrictive here, and that's where we're going to make a modification. So instead of processing everything in the company entity, let's get rid of this, and in single quotes, let's put our collection name for other companies, which based on our input flow, remember that name of the input flow is a collection that then gets applied to the resulting documents. So we can say other companies because that is the name of our flow and that is the name of the collection on those docs. This is case sensitive, so double check, make sure you've got this looking correct. And by the way, if you don't want to type in this code, you can also reference all the sample code in the folder that you've cloned from the MarkLogic University GitHub site. You'll note that there's a code folder in here and the plugins are given to you if you wish to just copy and paste. All right, what we then need to do is save our plugins, so let's go ahead and click Save. And for this first example of a harmonized flow, this is now all that we need to do. We don't need to make any other changes to these plugins because the mapping is really what we want to apply, and that will happen for us automatically. So what we want to do next is run the flow. So let's click Flow Info. And then down here, let's go ahead and click Run Harmonize. And we can see that a job is starting and we get our status tracked up here in the Quick Start. And when it finishes, we can then go ahead and check out the results. Now, just like with input flows, we could go to the Jobs tab and see the results. And I can see here that my harmonized flow ran, it finished. I'm not getting any error indicators here, so that's a good sign. And then, of course, the real proof, we want to look at the resulting data. So let's click on Browse Data. But now we don't want to look at staging because the whole process of curating our data and running harmonization flows takes data from staging and moves it to final. So we want to change this over to final. And now let's take a look at what we've got. You can see that we now have 500 documents. They're in a collection based on the entity by default. And these 500 documents are what we processed in that flow. And they are all those documents of companies outside the Fortune 500. Let's look at what is the result. So if we select one of these documents, again, you'll see the envelope pattern here. And this is our final curated enveloped data. So the key thing to notice here now is the instance data. This is everything that we defined for our company entity, modeled as we wish, in the appropriate data type, in the appropriate property name. By default, all of the original data that we processed in staging is retained, and that is retained in the attachments section of the envelope. And that is for compliance purposes in case you had a business reason that you needed to always be able to go back and see what the original data was, as well as what the curated data is. And it's that curated data, remember, that section of the envelope called instance data that we're then going to use to power our data services. All right, congratulations, you've created your first harmonization flow. All right, so let's then do it again. Let's now go back to flows, and we're going to create a new harmonization flow in order to curate the Fortune 500 data. So let's click the plus button here over by Harmonize Flows, and let's call this one Harmonize Fortune 500. Now, when we're configuring this, under mapping generation, let's tell it to use that mapping that we created specifically for the Fortune 500 data, and then everything else as the default is okay here. Let's go ahead then and click Create. We've now got our new harmonization flow created. Let's take a look at the plugins. And just like before, let's start with the collector plugin. And again, that's defining which documents we're going to process here. And we want to process just the Fortune 500 documents. So we're going to change this collection query here in order to point to just the Fortune 500 collection. Let's go ahead and save that plugin. And next, let's take a look at the content plugin. So we haven't looked at the content plugin yet, and the role of the content plugin is to generate that curated instance data. And if you recall, this is where we're going to have to figure out that profit margin value and make sure that we include it here for this data source, because that profit margin is not inherently in the original data. So let's scroll down through some of this JavaScript code. And the function that's really critical for us to understand here is what's happening in this extract instance company function that gets created for us, because this is where that instance data is getting generated. And what you can see here is if we start by looking at line 54, what we see is JavaScript code that actually is programmatically applying the mappings that we generated when we created our mappings for this shape of data. And if we look at that, we can see that there is on line 58 a line for profit margin. But if you recall, we didn't point that to anything because the profit margin didn't exist in this source of data. So if we were to just run this flow as is, we would end up with a profit margin in our instance data, but that would just be null. And so instead what we're going to do is we are going to calculate the profit margin based on the total revenue and the total profit that we're getting out of this current document that's being processed. So let's go to line 58 here, and I'm just going to comment out the boilerplate code that was created for us for profit margin. And below that, I'm going to add another line of code which performs the calculation. And as you can see here, looking at this new line of code, we're taking the variable that's in total profit, the value of the variable total revenue, dividing those, and then multiplying by 100 and making sure that that is of data type decimal to align with our entity configuration and our indexes. And then that profit margin, which we're calculating here, will then get applied to our instance data and included in the final result. So let's go ahead and save this code here. And then let's go back to flow info, and we're going to run the flow. And by the way, if you want to reference the solution code, remember that you can get it from the MarkLogic University GitHub site. And when you clone the project, you're going to get this code folder. And inside of there, you're going to see plugin code. And we have the plugins that we've modified for both the other company flow and this new flow that we're going to run right now, Harmonize Fortune 500. So you can always copy and paste from there if you wish. All right, once you've got your plugins how you desire, let's go ahead and run this Harmonize flow. And we'll see the status of our job as it's running. We should get the finish. And of course, then we want to validate it. So we can go over here to jobs and validate that our Harmonize flow did finish without errors. And then we want to go and browse data. And again, we want to look at the final database to see what this curated data looks like. And let's find one of those examples of a Fortune 500 company. If you recall, the URI pattern for a Fortune 500 data looks like this. So here's a good example. Let's go ahead and click on that. And we can see in the instance data that we now have the calculated profit margin. So after curation, we now have run 2 harmonized flows, and we have modeled the instance data across both of our different shapes of company data to be represented in a way that will let us build data services against that instance data. And here you can see an example of Fortune 500 data and an example of companies outside of the Fortune 500 data, and you can see that that instance data is in a consistent shape. All right, so come with me, and in the next video, we're going to learn how to access data out of our hub by implementing some data services.